Dear participants, good morning and welcome to our fifth and last We Buy Social EU lunchtime talk. We're very happy to see so many of you present today, and we're also very glad that you seem to be interested in the topic of work conditions in public procurement. First thing first, let me quickly recall how the meeting works today. So all of the participants are taking part via web streaming. Take into account that there is a delay of about 45 seconds with what is going on here. Only the speakers' microphones and video are switched on, and you can always interact with us by posing your questions through Slido. You will see the code on the slide, so it's #lunch6. And we will have a short time for a question and answer at the end of the talk. Please identify yourself when you're posting your question through Slido. And today's agenda is, as usual, very straightforward. After this short introduction, we will discuss with our speaker, and then, as I was saying, we will have the Q&A and some closing remarks. So the objective of today's event is to discuss a very specific set of social considerations in public procurement. You will remember that we published our guide, Buying Social, around this time last year, and that this guide provides public buyers with concrete indications on how to use social considerations in public procurement, and it is structured around the public procurement process, and it covers different social objectives. And among these social objectives it's of course how to ensure that workers which are employed in the performance of public procurement contracts are treated fairly and benefit from decent working conditions. And in particular, the guide explains that EU rules on public procurement make it compulsory for national authorities to ensure that social and labor rights are complied with in the execution of public contracts. And it also explains how to use the tools and the mechanisms that are made available under EU law to make this happen. For example, exclusion grounds and contract clauses. These instruments are, of course, not in the law just as some generic legal clarification or reminder, but they are really essential provisions to make sure that efficiency in public contracts is not achieved, let's say, at the cost of decent work. And this becomes all the more important when we talk about labor-intensive economic activities, of course, because too much emphasis on the price component and too few safeguards and checks on how the work is organized and what are the working conditions applicable to the staff can lead to serious breaches of labor law, but it can also, in the long run, affect very much the overall quality of the performance, of course, because the performance depends very much on the workers and the way they are effectively working on the contract. And of course, it's also a reputational and a policy consistency issue for public authorities, as they are supposed to also promote decent work, and they might end up being associated with labor violations if they don't pay attention. But we know that it is not always easy, of course, to use this type of considerations in the public procurement process, and this is why we are happy to discuss a good practice with you in this field today, and in the hopes that also it will inspire many of you, which is why today we have Eva Enoksen from Denmark. She's a CSR consultant in the task force of the city of Copenhagen. And she works to ensure decent pay and working conditions in all public contracts. She has a background as an EU analyst and EU advisor in the Danish Parliament. Welcome, Eva. Good morning.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me.
So I will start with a very basic question to you. Why did the city of Copenhagen decide to pay attention to labor issues in public procurement?
Well, I guess several reasons. We've had labor clauses in our contract since 2011. And one reason is that in Denmark, I don't know if you know, but in Denmark, we don't have a minimum wage. We don't have a national minimum wage. So we only have our labor system where we have collective bargaining and collective agreements. So that means that unless you work at a company where you are covered by a collective agreement, there are actually no minimum wage. So in order to ensure that in the public contracts that we did have some idea of the labor condition and wages, Copenhagen started, along with other municipalities in Denmark, to use labor clauses in 2011. One reason is, of course, to make sure that the workers performing on these contracts, that they have the fair condition and wage. But another reason is also, as you mentioned, to ensure the fair competition from the companies. And actually, when we started doing this in Denmark, it was something that was also very popular with the employer side, because the companies who were paying the collective agreement wages and who had decent working conditions, they were being undercut in public contracts by companies with lower wages, worse labor conditions. And so in order to make sure that we have a standard of wage and working condition, we started using these labor clauses in our contracts. In 2014, the city of Copenhagen decided that it's not enough just to have a contract clause, you actually have to follow up on it. Because again, if you don't, then it will benefit the companies which are going to not comply and have no intention of complying. Therefore, they can put in a lower offer in the tender. But also because all indications in the Danish labor market said that we would have some serious breaches. So this has been done since 2014 by an external actor. And then in 2018, the city of Copenhagen decided to have an internal task force in the organization in order to make sure that the competences and the knowledge stayed in the organization and that we could really follow up on all breaches. So yeah, I guess that's a background. Another reason is that in Copenhagen, we've had a social democratic leadership in the city council for over 100 years. So the political landscape was really sympathetic to this agenda.
Thank you, Eva. And I think it's very interesting to hear you say that this was a welcome change for the businesses, the potential suppliers, because often what we hear is that if you try to push for better or even the minimum standard for labor conditions, then somehow this is not welcomed by suppliers. But I hear you say it was quite the contrary.
The big organized suppliers, they were quite open to this because I think they saw it as a benefit to them. And also you had more and more companies coming in from the rest of the EU, and they were also undercutting wages. And so in order to have a competitive advantage in the public contracts, the well-organized companies, they needed to make sure that you could not, the competition wouldn't be on wage in these contracts.
Thank you. That's very clear. Can you maybe tell us a bit more, because Copenhagen has a strategy to fight social dumping. So can you tell us a bit more about that? Because it probably also gives us a bit of a better idea of the context and how that strategy was linked to public procurement.
Yes. Well, as I said, we've been using these labor clauses since 2011, and the strategy is really to use contract clauses, but more importantly, to follow up on them. So we have our labor clauses, and also we have a CSR clause that makes sure that also on goods that we have working condition and the human and working conditions ensured all over the global supply chain as well. But the labor clauses we use in construction contracts and service contracts. And there are no, I mean, we don't have a baseline saying that smaller contracts than this amount is not covered by labor clauses. So it's everything, all construction, all services. Which means that it's fairly clear for the suppliers. Of course, we also always have new suppliers coming in, and then we have to make sure that they understand what does this mean, and we do that in the tender. But a lot of our, at least in construction, a lot of our suppliers are long-term suppliers, so they know this in Copenhagen. Then we follow up during the contract, and this is done by my unit. So we are a task force of, I think now we are 10 people doing this. And concretely what we do is that we go out unannounced on, for example, a construction site. And then we look around, we talk to the workers. We always start talking to the management and say, hello, we are from the city of Copenhagen. We have some flyers, usually they know us, and then we take a walk on the building site. And then we talk to the workers and we ask them about their pay, working conditions. And of course, we have more and more knowledge about what are risks. So, you know, people working for a subcontractor, people working in unskilled fields, people working with no security, people with no language skills in Denmark. All of these are risk factors. And then if we think there is a risk of underpayment or breach of the labor clause, then we go back to our office and then we ask the main contractor to provide us with documentation for working hours, pay, tax, benefits, and all of this. And then we, in a perfect world, when we take all of this documentation, and then we see, okay, in, for example, these 2 weeks where this person has been on the construction site, they have made this much money. And then we look at the collective bargaining agreement for that type of work. And then we say, what should they have had? And if there's a difference, then we go to the main contractor and we say, you have to repay this person. And then we follow the case until we have documentation that the person has been reimbursed for the lack of pay in that period. So that's a perfect scenario. Often what actually happens is that we have to work very hard to get the documentation. We have to revisit the building site many times. We have to have a dialogue with the subcontractor, which is usually the ones who have the breaches. And we have a dialogue with the employees during a case to make sure that the documentation we get reflects reality. Very often we have, for example, time schedules, timesheets, which are fake, basically. So it can be a quite lengthy process, but we do get a lot of money back to the workers this way. What we do, of course, we can't check everything every day, all the time. So our approach is a risk-based approach. So we try really to use our resources where we think there is a risk. So we don't just do random checks. We go for the risk areas, the risk contracts, and yeah.
So what I hear from you is basically that the mechanisms that you're using are grounded in contract clause, but then most of the work is actually done when you verify that the contract clauses that you use are actually complied in the performance of the contract. So it's really very much based on verification during the contract management,
Yes.
let's say. Yeah.
It is. It is, and this is where the resources are used, because the contract clause is the same on all contracts. And of course, we update it every few years to make sure that it's workable and representative of the problems that we find. But basically, it's the same labor clause on all contracts, and which makes it easy for us to work with, but also it makes it quite easy for the suppliers that they know this clause. It's the same every time. And then the work is really to make sure that they live up to it. And I can tell you that before, when we had the external agency or auditor doing our checkups, they found breaches in about 5.5% of the checkups or the audits that they did. When we took over internally, and we switched to a risk-based approach where we didn't just do random samples, but we looked at a risk, and then we asked for documentation if we found that there was a risk, and after talking to people and so on, that number went from 5.5% of the cases up to 70%, which means, and it's more or less stable. It means that if we go out and we think there is a risk of a breach, and then we ask for documentation, in 70% of the cases we are right, then we do find a breach. So that's quite high. And it tells us that it's really necessary to do these checkups and these audits, otherwise it's going to be Wild West, especially in construction, transport, and cleaning services. We have quite big issues there.
Yeah, those are generally sectors where we see that there are very frequently labor issues, also partially because they are indeed labor intensive, but also cleaning services, for example, they tend to attract maybe lower skilled workers or workers which are requalifying. So I can totally see why it's a risk factor per se, that the subject matter of the contract itself. Do you run any checks, for example, on the track record or the experience of companies on this before, during the procurement procedure, or is it something that is taken into account?
Not that much. I mean, we do have, in general, the contract manager who has a contract will know that sector pretty well, and they will know which company will probably bid and so on. But unless you have had a formal breach of contract, we can't exclude them. And even then, as you know, then they need to be able to self-clean. So excluding people from bidding is actually quite a difficult task. You can, of course, be, more creative of how you make the contracts or the point system or something. But in general, people can, or companies can bid if they want. We have had some cases where we've excluded companies because of formal breaches, especially a very big case last year. But it's not something that's generally done that much. Where we use our energy is that we in our team have a risk track record, so to speak. So we know the companies, we can look at our database and say, have they had cases before? So it goes into our risk assessment. So that means if we have a company where they have had problems before, either with the unions or with us, then we will have it in our database, we can look it up, and then we will pay extra attention. So we will make sure that if they're there, then they still have to comply, because we will be there a lot and make sure that they comply with the clauses. And for us, it actually makes more sense because we are, of course, there is a general concern in the municipality to have good quality contracts, good prices, and all of this. For our team, what is really important is the workers. So our concern is to make sure that the workers, that they have decent jobs with decent wages. And if we get these companies in and we follow up intensely with them, then the workers will actually end up in jobs with some decent pay and working condition. So it's a way that we can also regulate some of the companies who would normally try to cheat, but because we know it from our database and from our knowledge and risk assessment, then we can make sure that we pay the necessary attention so that their workers also have these benefits and these decent work conditions.
I think it's a very interesting example because we tend to often see things in procurement as if you have a bad track record, you can get excluded, which, as you say, is particularly difficult to do for public buyers, and they're taking an additional risk also when they are excluding someone from a procedure. But focusing on focusing on what actually happens when you have a contract, and I think it also maybe pushes, because these, I suppose suppliers know very well that you have this policy in place and that you have these systems of checks in place, so it pushes them to become more virtuous rather than, you know, excluding them ex ante and not giving them even the possibility maybe to improve, or pushing them to improve.
And especially in construction, you know, you have very long supply chains. So if we have, of course, a contract with our main contractor, but then they will hire, we have an ID card system where they have to register their sub-suppliers and the workers. And we can see in that system, which was actually surprising both to us when we started a few years ago, but also to the main contractors, that in a fairly small building sites, renovation of a small school or something like that, you will typically have around 100 subcontractors actually building that school or renovating that school. That's a lot of subcontractors. And of course, in our clauses, we have the chain responsibility written into the clause, which means that in the end, the responsibility lies with the main contractor. So unless they have put that clause in their suppliers contracts all the way down the chain, it will end with them. And this responsibility means that, of course, they need to have some focus on their sub-suppliers and make sure that they know about this clause in the contracts with Copenhagen, and that they really do have to follow it. But the problem is that if you have 100 sub-suppliers, it can be really difficult. Often the main contractor, they don't actually know who's building. When we go out to a construction site, it would be very typical. We go to the building management first and say, hello, we're here. And then we ask who are on the site right now, who are working. And then they'll say, oh, we have some carpenters over here from this company. There's some bricklayers over here and some roofers up there. And then we have a list. And then we go out and find maybe 5, 6, 7 other companies working on the site that the main contractor on site, they don't know that they're there, because their subcontractors, they also subcontract parts of the contract and so on, and they don't tell the main contractor that they're doing this. And that makes it really difficult for the main contractor to have this, to control this. So this means that, and also the fact that we are checking up on it and making them aware that they have all of these companies working in the contractor that they know, it has been a process where the big main contractor that we meet again and again, they are becoming more and more aware that they really, really have to manage their supply chain in order to make sure that they don't end up paying for fines or paying salaries to subcontractors, workers, because in the end, we are asking the main contractor to reimburse these workers unless they can get their subcontractors to do it for them. So it has meant also that the contractors, they are starting to take their responsibility more seriously, and they really are focusing more and more on getting these supply chains in order. Because normally we don't find the breaches with the main contractor. They are covered by a collective bargaining agreement. And they have decent wages for their workers. But when you come down to the sub-suppliers or the sub-sub-suppliers, then the problem starts.
That's also a very interesting approach to making sure, because you know, as you said, there can be contracts with several subcontractors, so it's difficult also for the public authority to enforce something directly on the subcontractors when even the main contractor sometimes doesn't know who is working on their work sites. So
therefore, the chain responsibility in the labor clause is really instrumental to our work. Otherwise, it would be almost impossible. And one more thing is that when we find these breaches, I mean, I think when you talk to other public procurers around Europe, what we often hear is that they have, if they have cases, if they find breaches for some reason, then they will kick out their supplier and find a new one, kick them off the contract. And of course, that's a very easy option. Then you are, as a public procurer, you are clean, you have taken affair, you have handled the problem, but it's not helping the workers that this company has kicked off the contract. They are not going to be reimbursed. They're not going to have decent working conditions after that. So what we always do is to focus on reimbursement, saying, okay, you have to stop the breach, and you have to make sure that you have done remedy. And if they do that, and they document that they have done that, then they can stay on the contract. And we always prefer that rather than just kicking them out, because it's not in the workers' interest to be kicked out.
Thank you. I think that's interesting. I wanted to just take a small step back and ask you a bit about the task force itself, because if I understand correctly, you are doing most of the work for this specific aspect of the execution of the contract. So you are a huge help, I suppose, to the procurement officers or to the contract managers.
Yes.
So I just wanted to maybe know a little bit more who you are, how you're organized, how do you intervene also. You said that you're working on the basis of a risk assessment, of course, but do you always intervene, or do you wait maybe for the public authority to call you?
So we have, I mean, physically we are located along in the procurement team. So we sit with the contract managers. Copenhagen is a very big municipality, so we have contracts being done all over the municipality, but there is a central purchasing unit, and we are placed there, which is done deliberately to make sure that the contract managers and the one doing the tenders, that they are aware that we are there, and that they can also just walk over and ask us. And they, I mean, they never forget a labor clause in a contract after we moved in, because we are right there. So that helps. The team, as I said, we actually started out being 6 people. Now we are, I think, 12. And we have very different backgrounds, which is also deliberate. So we have a number of academics with different backgrounds. We also have a bricklayer who has a background, of course, in construction. So he's our construction site expert, which is hugely helpful, because when we go out, I mean, to begin with, I didn't know how to walk around a construction site. I didn't know what to ask, where we had this expert. So we didn't seem the odd one out when we came to the construction site, because he knew what he was doing. So that was really helpful. And it's still very helpful to have someone with an eye for what is going on in a construction site. Then we have a few other people with a background in the trade union. And so we have tried to have a team of mixed backgrounds and competences, and I think that's hugely helpful. In terms of how we intervene with the contract managers, when we started, I mean, when we go out to do an inspection, we never, it's always on our own initiative. And we don't tell either the contractor that we're coming or actually the contract manager. And the reason is that the contract manager, their job is really to have a good relationship with the contractor or the supplier of services or whatever, the company. And what we learned in the beginning is that even though we tell them that this is something that you should not tell the contractor that we are coming, it tended to slip their tongue, or they would have a dialogue with them about it. And so now we always go out ourselves, and then if we find something, then we contact the contract manager, and we just put them actually CC on all emails to the main supplier, so that they know what is going on in the case. But we do the work; they don't have to do anything, unless we have to sanction, because probably the same for all municipalities. The contract owner, the contract manager, is the only one who can use the sanctions, because it's not our contract, it's their contract. So that means that if we have a case where we need to use some sanctions, then we write the contract manager and we simply say, I attached an email that you should send to this contractor saying, if you don't do this and this in 5 days, we'll start sanctions. So we make it extremely easy for them to do the things that we need them to do in order to push a case forward. We also have, we use, I mean, if we find that there is a breach, or if we don't get the information we need, or at any point really in a case, we can call the contractor, the subcontractor which has a breach, and then usually also the contract manager. And then we will have a meeting and try to handle the conflict. So we will typically present them with our findings, saying, we met this and this people, they were working under these and these conditions. The collective agreement says that they should have worked under these conditions, so there is a discrepancy. We found that you owe them this much money. And then we ask the the contractor or the supplier, what do you think about that? And that way we get both, give them a chance to defend themselves. Sometimes there are things that we haven't learned, or, you know, there might be explanations that we don't have, or they might disagree with the collective agreement that we chose for that type of work. So we get really our case, I mean, they get to comment on the case that we're building. And in these meetings, we also have the contract manager. Usually we don't expect them to do much, but in order for them to know what's going on in their contract, they're part of it. But the work is ours, and the dialogue with the contractor or the suppliers, that's also really ours. So it's minimum effort for the contract managers, but they are informed and part of it as much as they want.
Yeah, as I was saying before, I suspected already that you were a huge help in dealing with these particular aspects. Also, I find it quite interesting because normally contract managers are not necessarily experts in this kind of things. So for them, there's a huge learning curve if they have to deal also with, you know, making sure that, for example, some contract clauses are complied with. Maybe they have a model contract clause that they can reuse and apply, but it's difficult when you're doing it on your own and you don't have the variety of competencies also that you have in the task force. Can I ask you as the last question, if you have noticed any improvement since you've started implementing this policy? Do you think it's been successful? Do you have any data on that, or do you have any feedback also from workers themselves, for example?
Yeah, we do collect data on all of our cases, and we publish a report every year where you can see, you know, the number of cases. We usually have about 600 audits every year, so it's we do get a lot of data. In terms of improvements, yes, we find improvements with certain suppliers, you know, where you have a process. In the beginning, they are very resistant. They don't understand why we are there. They think it's burdensome to collect the documentation. But usually when we ask for documentations, we are really right that there is a problem. So we see that progress with a number of our suppliers, whereas now when we come out, they say, yeah, we know you, go ahead, look around. And if we find something with their sub-suppliers, then they are more and more helpful in trying to solve it. Also, in terms of the number of sub-suppliers, as I mentioned, we see more and more awareness from especially the big main contractors to have more control over their sub-suppliers. I can't show you statistics saying that we have less and less breaches or less and less what we call social dumping, because we move around in new fields. So last year, for example, we had a slight decrease in number of cases in construction. It could suggest that the effort that we've had for a long time in construction is working, but it's difficult to say because it's only 1 year, so maybe next year will go up. So I can't say for sure. But we also, apart from construction and a number of other things, we every year we pick a new area of interest to focus on, because we have so many contracts, we can't do everything all the time. So every year we say, okay, now we need to look at these contracts. For example, services to nursing homes, social services, private kindergartens. So there are a number of areas we can look at. Last year, we started looking at transport, which obviously, as you know, is a major area. And we've had really, really big cases there. And we've had 99.2% breaches in the audits we have done. So almost every single audit we did had rather large breaches of contract. So large underpayment, bad work conditions, and so on. So the general number tends to stay very stable because we choose new areas all the time to look at. There is a small decrease last year in construction, but I don't want to promise anything. What it does show us is that our effort, the task force, is necessary, and if we were not there, I think we would see a whole lot more. And then I'll say 70% is, of course, not 70% of all suppliers. It is 70% of the ones that we choose to audit, which we do based on risk assessment. So, of course, we have a number of really good suppliers in this municipality of Copenhagen, which comply with all of the contract clauses and are doing really great. But we also continuously have problems because we have new suppliers coming in, because we have some suppliers who keep not performing according to the contract, and because we have new areas all the time to look at. We've only been at it for 4 years, and we have, it's endless number of contracts to look at.
Yeah, I think in this area it's particularly difficult to define success, especially if you are expanding on the type of contracts that you're checking, and as you can say, as you said, you can always have new suppliers to check on who may be less aware or might be willing to take more risks than other suppliers. So it's to a certain extent, the success is also secondary in the sense that you are there to perform checks that should be performed somehow. So it doesn't matter if it improves very quickly, if the situation improves very quickly, but it's important that you're there.
The success that we see is more qualitative than quantitative, so to speak. And of course, we consider it a success every time we get reimbursement for one worker. So that's also a success rate, that we actually get money back to the workers who have been underpaid.
Okay, thank you, Eva. I think we have a couple of questions from the audience. So maybe I will go for the first one, which is from Mark Berfeld from Uni Europa. And he asks which sectors and jobs you have identified as risk areas in Copenhagen.
I mean, we already touched upon it a little bit. We have, for example, transport. What we are looking at right now is these delivery services. So, for example, delivering food to elderly people in their own homes. These short, small vehicle delivery services. And one thing that we see is that they are being treated as independent contractors, the drivers, but actually they are to be considered employees. And the labor clause therefore holds for them as well. And here we have found huge problems, which is probably not a surprise to anyone, but we are only just beginning in that. The same with taxis and moving services also have a lot of issues. Then we have the whole construction sector. I mean, in general, we have problems there, but especially in unskilled work. So you can have, we see a lot if you are demolishing things, cleanup of sites, stuff like that, where you have service companies coming in at the very end of the supply chain, and they are unskilled, and usually the workers are foreigners, either coming in to do the job with a Danish company imported for that specific task, or they could be living in Denmark but with no education and very poor language skills. So we look also in a construction site, we look at these risk areas that we know. Then we have cleaning, which is a huge thing. Of course, probably in all of Europe, it's very often unskilled labor. We have a lot of people coming in from Bulgaria and Romania to perform these jobs, and they are not aware of their rights, even as EU citizens. It's often done at night, so it's invisible work, which of course makes it much easier to cheat. So we have to get up at night and go out and talk to them when they are cleaning the administrative areas in the municipality. Then we have had also actually a lot of problems with private kindergartens where the municipality gives money for subsidies for the kindergartens. And here we see that the employees are working under salaries which are a lot lower than the collective agreement. And it's been very unregulated up until a few years ago. So we've seen a lot of that as well. And a number of other areas, but these are some of the focus areas that we have.
Thank you. We received in the meantime quite a few questions for you, but let me maybe just ask you the last one, because otherwise we're running a bit over time. And in particular, do you think that there should be rules also at European level that specify that contracting authorities should actively ensure compliance with labor standards, including, for example, the right to participate in a union, and do so throughout the supply chain? Do you think it would help to have, let's say, hard legislation on this? And this is a question from Professor Georgopoulos from the University of Nottingham.
Yes, I think at least if you do use contract clauses or contract performance clauses, I think, yes, you should really follow up on them. Whether it should be EU legislation or it should be national legislation, I'm not sure. But of course, legislation would mean that public procurers, they would have to take this area seriously. And unfortunately, it's still the case that most public procurers, if they do anything, then they just put in a clause in a contract and try to forget all about it. And it doesn't work. So yeah, I think it would be great to have stronger legislation in this area, saying that you really, if you ask this in the contract, you need to follow up on it. Both in terms of fairness in the competition, but also because we see that this is a huge area, and if it's not, if you don't check up, it's completely unregulated, and it's not going to help the workers. So yeah, I think more legislation would be a good thing in this area.
Well, thank you very much, Eva, for being with us today, and for all the good inspiration that you provided us. It's been a pleasure. We are running out of time, so I will quickly maybe close the session. As I was saying, this is unfortunately for the time being our last lunchtime talk in a series on socially responsible public procurement that we've run starting in October last year. But you can rewatch all 5 of our lunchtime talks on YouTube. You just need to go on the EU Growth channel on YouTube, and then click on the public procurement playlist of the channel. We will continue to produce some extra content and post it on that channel. We have interviews also with some of the speakers that we've hosted in our lunchtime talks. And we will continue to have webinars in general on issues of sustainability and innovation. So please stay tuned. We also have a number of interesting webinars planned for the next few weeks. We have a workshop on the upcoming guidance on procurement of sustainable infrastructure, which will take place on the 30th of June. It's the final event where we will we'll present the structure of the guidance, and we will consult with the stakeholders who want to join the meeting. We will also have our workshop of the Green Public Procurement Help Desk on using the innovation partnership in the social sector on the 22nd of June, and our final masterclass on how to price the value of innovation in an innovation partnership on the 21st of June. And finally, as usual, this is our great team working on strategic public procurement, without which this would not happen. And thank you very much for your participation. Thank you for all the questions, and see you soon. Have a nice day.